So good morning and welcome to Module 15 in our series of nutrition courses, seminars. And today we're going to be dealing with toxic metals and problems with radiation, which will include geopathic stress, electrical stress, and regarding sick house syndromes. So we're going to start off today with the toxic metals and radiation. So there's no more fascinating subject, more worthy of study than nature. To understand this great mechanism, to discover the forces which are active and the laws that govern them, is the highest aim of the human intelligence. So Nikola Tesla said that, who is famous not for the cars, but for the introduction of electricity, with his opposition, who was Edison, that we'll talk about later on this afternoon, and who won the day as to which way the currents flow and whether we used AC or DC. So essential minerals and toxic minerals. So there's roughly 100 elements in the universe. So the elements that are on our planet are exactly the same as the elements that are on the moon, that are on Jupiter, and the stars that we can see, and all the stars in the farthest galaxy, if there is such a thing, away. So all the elements are identical. And some of these elements out of the 100 are essential. So roughly a third are essential to humans. And roughly a third are neutral, let's say. They're neither particularly essential or not essential. And roughly 1/3 are toxic. Now, what are toxic to some creatures and plants may not be toxic to us, and vice versa. And a good example of this is arsenic. Arsenic is highly toxic to human beings and most animals, but certain plants thrive on it and need arsenic to improve their growth and procreation. So essential minerals, therefore, are the things that are essential. And when I use the word minerals, I mean that quite loosely, because I'm going to include oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, etc. in there. So technically, when we think about minerals, we think about them actually being metals, but not all the things that we're going to be talking about are strictly metallic. Now, we know that when you heat an element, it gives off a spectroscopic emission, which is like a barcode. And this is how astronomers can tell that Jupiter is largely made of methane gas, solid methane gas, because methane, when it's heated, gives off a particular spectroscopic emission or glow. And each element in the universe has its own individual barcode or glow. And when those colours in that barcode come together, they give a particular beam of light, which we see and interpret as blue or orange or green or whatever it might be. And we see that on November the 5th every day with fireworks. So when you see a blue flash go up, a red flash, etc., that's a particular element in there which is being burnt. Those of you who've got orange streetlights around your area know that an orange streetlight is sodium gas inside there. And when sodium is heated, it produces this spectroscopic emission or barcode of a series of colours, which when they come together form orange. And you know also that when you turn the electricity off, the light goes off and the orange disappears. And that's called a ground state. So when you heat the gas up, it's in an excited state, so it emits like a night storage heater. And when you turn it off, it starts to absorb that light, and so it looks black or dull. Okay, so that's spectroscopic absorption. So we have a spectroscopic emission, which is when we give out the light or the wavelengths of that particular element. And we have a spectroscopic absorption when it takes those same wavelengths back into the compound. So an excited and a ground state. Now, if we think about that, therefore, if we have magnesium and we require magnesium, a person will strengthen to the spectroscopic emission of magnesium because they need it, and the absorption, which would actually suck that light waves back into them, the person would weaken to them because they want the magnesium, so you don't want to suck the energy of the magnesium out of the person. So a strong muscle will weaken. So a weak muscle will strengthen to the emission, and a strong muscle will weaken to the absorption. So let's now move to the toxic ones. The toxic ones obviously are bad, and therefore the spectroscopic emission of a toxic element, let's say mercury here, you'd expect to weaken a person. because it's toxic. Okay, if they give out that wavelength, the person who's going to muscle, strong muscle, will go weak. Whereas the spectroscopic absorption will absorb the wavelength of that mercury when it acts almost like like a homeopathic antidote. So all you have to remember with spectroscopic elements is the first one, that the essential minerals, a spectroscopic emission strengthens a weak muscle. If you can remember that and it makes sense that the person will strengthen the magnesium if they need it, you can then work out, obviously a toxic one does the opposite. Okay, and if you just bear that in mind, then you haven't got to worry about the other two because they're always the opposite to the emission and the absorption. Right, so Mendeleev was the first person to put the periodic table together, and he didn't put all of it together because there are a lot of elements which were unknown in the 1800s and have subsequently been discovered. Having put all this together, he was never honoured until recently, or more recently, they've discovered more elements with higher atomic weights which are artificially made and last for only fractions of a second. And as we see, they honoured him with his name on one of those elements. So he lived from 1834 to 1907, was a Russian chemist and inventor. He formulated the periodic table, created a far-sighted version of the periodic table of elements and used it to correct the properties of some already discovered elements and also to predict properties of 8 elements that hadn't been discovered. So there were gaps in there, so he knew that there were elements that were yet to be discovered. It's again an indication that what we think we know everything about, we don't. You know, there's probably hosts of vitamins out there which haven't been discovered yet, but because they're not in the books, and I often wondered why we had vitamin A, B, C, D and E, and what's happened to all the other ones in between up to K, and what happened from K to P and P on down. Are they vitamins yet to be discovered? Okay, so we have essential minerals and we have toxic ones. So we're familiar from previous seminar on essential nutrients, essential minerals. So boron, calcium, copper, chromium, possibly indium, iodine, iron, magnesium, manganese, molybdenum, platinum possibly, potassium, selenium, silica, silver, sulfur and zinc. We might put silver and platinum as conditionally essential elements. You might want to include gold in there. These are conditional, that in certain circumstances they can be very useful. Now what makes an essential mineral is whether they've discovered a mineral cofactor in an enzyme that requires that mineral. So we know that there's perhaps 90% of enzymes require magnesium as a cofactor. Therefore, magnesium is an essential nutrient. We know molybdenum, at least 3 pathways, enzymes, which are molybdenum dependent. That makes molybdenum an essential nutrient. There are no known pathways for platinum and for gold and for silver, but they do seem to help the immune system, maybe as an allosteric effector to boost the enzyme up to get it to function better, or they could even work as a toxic substance and shut one enzyme down, which allows the other one to open up. So we'll have a look at that in the next seminar in the immune system of how we can use silver and platinum and gold. Now you'll see that some of these have also got arrows going up and down because they can also be toxic. Like anything, even if it's oxygen or water, too much of something can be toxic. So although it's essential, we can have an excess amount. And these are slightly dodgy ones where we can get excesses on relatively low doses or the wrong form of the element, the wrong valency. So copper, chromium, iron and manganese, these can become toxic in higher doses than the recommended daily allowance, or a certain number of times that amount. So these are the essential ones. Now the toxic ones, and the ones that we really are going to be talking about or have a brief look today, is aluminium, antimony, arsenic, beryllium, bismuth, bromine, cadmium, cesium, chlorine, cobalt, fluorine, lead, lithium, mercury, nickel, palladium, promethium, radium, radon, thallium and thorium, and uranium. And the ones with the asterisk here, arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, nickel are known to be carcinogenic. So those are obviously important ones to be able to diagnose and to deal with and to be able to detoxify, because these are known to be mutagenic. They can change the DNA structure and form polymorphisms. So the ones here which I've ringed are the essential ones which we're going to really look at in more detail today. So toxic metals, toxicity underlines all modern chronic diseases. So toxins are a constant battle for us to be able to detoxify, because we're exposed to toxins in the environment all the time, and it's a battle of our detoxification systems. Now, the way the body detoxifies metals is different from detoxifying chemicals. So in the last module we looked at cytochrome P450s and the phase 2 detoxifying liver enzymes. The way we detoxify metals is a slightly different route. So toxicity underlines a lot of chronic diseases, such as Alzheimer's, of course, which has been linked to aluminium toxicity, asthma, chronic fatigue syndrome, insulin resistance or syndrome X, multiple chemical sensitivities, allergies, ankylosing spondylitis, perhaps arthritis, dermatitis, maybe psoriasis. So toxic metals can affect different systems in the body, certainly affect the nervous system, the neurological, and this could be developing sensory pins and needles or numbness, or motor effects, immune disorders. So toxic metals can interfere with the immune system from functioning, mental conditions as a result of the change in the brain chemicals, allergic conditions, and possibly malignancies. So it can lead to chronic inflammatory conditions, heart and circulatory problems, reproductive difficulties, tinnitus and hearing loss, and, as we say, insulin resistance. So toxic insults on body behind the rise of multiple chemical sensitivities. The symptoms depend on the nature of the toxin and the individual genotype, and in the time overwhelm the body's detoxification system. So as we're exposed to more and more metals and we can't detoxify them, we then start to accumulate them. And if you accumulate toxins, there's only one place to put it if you can't detoxify, and that's into the body fat. So we store it in the fat, and the brain, of course, the dry weight of the brain is 70% fat or oils. So the brain is a very handy place for the body to shift toxins into, breast tissue, subcutaneous fat, etc. As I said earlier, toxic metals can lead to many, many different problems, and as we'll see later on, it can certainly lead to sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, which of course are attracted towards metallic objects. So the quantity of toxin may be small, but damage is enormous. Some elements which are toxic are highly poisonous in minute amounts. You know, mercury, arsenic, you don't need very much of. Although, having said that, some people can tolerate a greater amount than others. Why, we don't know. Maybe their ability to detoxify or store it in the fat. But the quantity of the toxin may be not necessarily proportional to the damage that it can create. Symptoms produced are out of proportion to the amount of toxin released, and can be anywhere or in any system of the body. And Weston Price recognised that back in the 1930s and 40s with his quest for trying to find perfect health in people, particularly from the dental perspective and from the effect of dental amalgams. So symptoms are a result of the types and concentration and the duration of the exposure. So sometimes a heavy, large exposure for a short period of time is less of a problem than chronic exposure for very long periods. So subtle leaking amalgams, exposure to small amounts of a toxic metal over a long period of time is probably much more damaging than a high exposure for a short period of time. The event can be a trigger. The reserve of the body has been reduced and gradually built up. And like all these things, it's like the barrel filling up. It's the last few drops that gets the blame and over the top. You know, quite a good example of this will probably be Parkinson's disease, that people don't develop Parkinson's disease in the sort of last couple of months of when they start to notice shaking. The general idea is that Parkinson's probably comes on for years and years and years before, but we don't see the symptoms. And you can lose something like 90% of the substantia nigra before the person starts to get shaking. So we could all be developing Parkinson's at this very, very moment, and there's theories that if we all lived long enough, we probably would all get Parkinson's disease. So this is one of the things for geneticists to be concerned about, because if they can extend life to, let's say, 150 years of age, which they're sort of talking about, it's possible that we all would have neurological problems, degenerative ones, by that time. Another very sad thing was that you probably wouldn't recognize each other. So you could have many years of a relationship with a friend or family and things, and then you don't see anybody like that for a period of time because you're getting older and older, and then you don't recognize them when you meet them again. And living a great age, it would be great if you are in perfect health. But that's not the case. And most of us go through periods of at least 10%, if not 30%, of our health, of our age when our health declines. Whereas in animals, it tends to be about 10%, something like that. And they say back in Victorian England, it was only towards the latter part that a lot of these degenerative problems weren't known about. Possibly because their nutritional intake was better, because they had more minerals and things in there, and of course less chemicals to detoxify. So recovery time is proportional to the length of time exposure to the toxins. So somebody who's been exposed to leaking amalgams for 5 years is going to get time to get that mercury out. It's not going to disappear by having the amalgams replaced. You've got to detoxify, and you may have to do that for quite some time before they're totally clear. So a toxin is anything that acts as a poison and can cause allergic reactions. The other thing through the periods of time that I've been dealing with particularly toxic metals is that they don't come out and create symptoms necessarily continuously. People seem to be able to eliminate or have a go at eliminating toxic metals in some form of cycle. So you can have a situation where the person has relatively low symptoms and then they get 1 or 2 days when it's really bad, and then they're okay again for a period of time. It doesn't seem to necessarily run in a rhythmical cycle, so there must be other factors which are involved in some way with why the body starts to eliminate at certain times. And if the patient happens to come to you when they're in a good part, you may miss the fact they got toxic metals as a problem. So we know that we can discover a lot about people by going around the meridians and finding out which is their major meridian where the person is coming from. And that may give you some clues. So obviously the liver meridian is something we look at as far as toxins. So in Chinese medicine we think about the liver as being the area for toxicity. The liver has obviously many functions, but for us it's to do with detoxification. The kidney and the bladder are the way the body spills out water-soluble toxins. So in the case of the liver, it would be more likely to be sort of fat-soluble toxins, which go through phase 1, phase 2 detoxification, whereas water-soluble compounds, which metals would largely be, would come out through the kidney or the bladder. So when the person has a major meridian dysfunction, or the major underfunctioning meridian is the bladder or the kidney, then think toxins, think toxic metals coming out through the water components of the body. Okay, so poison is dose dependent, slow and shut down the body functions, interferes with feedback mechanisms, corrupts messenger molecules and stops oxygen utilization. So that's basically how poisons work. In other words, a poison is a poison because it's going to kill you. And let's remember that all drugs are poisons. Okay? That's why we only have a certain number of milligrams or less as an active dose. If you have a certain number of grams of it, it'll kill you. So medicines are poisons because they inhibit enzymes from functioning. But that can be good from a therapeutic point of view in very small doses for periods of time while the body recovers. But you don't want to continue to take a medicine which is designed to inhibit a particular biological function because you're not solving the problem. Allergy or sensitivity is not dose dependent, triggers the immune system into a reaction. And if we trigger an overreaction of the immune system, we then get an allergic type of reaction, which we'll see in the next seminar with autoimmune diseases. And we may inhibit the immune system from functioning, in which case we find then we pick up infections. So we may have an overactive or an underactive with toxic metals immune system. And in some cases, people have both. They have an overactive of one particular type of the immune system, as we'll see. The adaptive immune system, and the innate system is underactive, etc. But we'll look at that in the next module. So poor nutrition reduces the effectiveness of the body to deal with toxins. So we know that having the right elements can often displace the bad ones. And as we'll see in the periodic table, the good element that displaces the bad one is usually adjacent to it on the periodic table. So it's either in the same column, the one above or the one below, or the one to the left or right, or maybe diagonal. Okay, but it's usually adjacent to it because it has similar chemical and physical properties to that particular element. So a good example of that would be mercury, where if you have a look on a periodic table, you'll see where mercury is, and then you'll see above it is zinc. So zinc will displace mercury, but it can also be the other way around, that mercury can displace zinc. Now, mercury is a much heavier element from its atomic weight than zinc, and therefore is harder to shift. So the heavier the weight is, the higher up the periodic table, if you like. That's why they become called heavy metals as opposed to just toxic metals. But that you would need substantially more of the good element to displace the bad one. So you'd need several, maybe 100 or more milligrams of zinc to displace, 1 milligram of mercury. So when you get up to the real heavy boys like the lead and the uranium, then you're going to have to use very high doses of the good element. So Candace Pert, who you may be familiar with her work with the body being a reflection of the subconscious, or the subconscious and the body become one, talked about the mental state has a direct physical effect. The mental state has a direct effect on the physical working of the body. There was the subconscious she talked about, is the body reflects that, lowers the resistance to infection and toxin. So you can think toxic thoughts and you can think infectious thoughts, if you like, and then they create these in the body. It lowers the immune system and weakens due to toxins and infections. So here we see a little chart on where the exposure could be to the toxins in the air that we breathe, in the water, dirt, etc. Here's the effect of air, and of course it can be, toxins can be in the food and in the medications. And in this case we're looking at not just toxic metals but chemicals as well. So the major uptake can be through the skin, so transdermal, what we put on the skin, the respiratory tract here, and what we breathe in, and what we absorb from the gut. And then if we go down further, we look at the transport, which is largely through the lymph and the blood. And then finally, the major excretory pathway is the sweat, the hair, the urine, and the feces. These are the major organs of elimination. And if any of these don't function optimally, it shunts it into the other one, which is why if a person has a bowel problem, they often get a skin problem. Okay? So most skin problems are toxins inside the body coming out, and it's usually because they need to open up the liver and the urinary pathways to be able to urinate the toxins and defecate the toxins out. So probably going back to this one with the hair is a lovely example of a toxin when people get alopecia and they get loss of hair, and loss of hair of the eyebrows, the eyelids, any body hair, pubic hair, etc. And this is usually mercury and arsenic. So when we come to look at those, remember if someone loses their hair or is losing their hair, think toxins, and mercury and arsenic are big poisons in the system. They inhibit folic acid from functioning, from being able to be activated, so it starves the hair roots. That's what happens in chemotherapy. It starves the folic acid from being able to activate, and so the first place you see it is with the hair dropping out. So the toxic mantle targets specific biochemical processes or enzymes. So for every good element, every enzyme requires a cofactor, which is a mineral of some form, to activate it. And therefore, if that mineral is displaced by a toxic one, the enzyme doesn't function. So usually the toxic mantle is very adjacent to the good one, which is needed, and it displaces it when it's in high amount. So another good example of that is carbonic anhydrase in the stomach, which helps us to produce hydrochloric acid. And that carbonic anhydrase is inhibited by mercury because it's a zinc-dependent enzyme. So zinc displaces mercury, or the other way around, mercury displaces zinc. So if we're deficient in zinc or we've got a high level of mercury, then we may get inhibited in our carbonic anhydrase. So this is a process of why toxic metals are toxic, because they displace the good metallic cofactors. They disrupt the cofactors for enzymes, particularly when the toxic metal has similar physical properties, which we said, mercury and zinc in carbonic anhydrase. They may get lodged into the cell membranes. The cell membranes are like, visualize a bubble in a bath. Okay, we've got a bubble, and that bubble's made of different oils, and in that membrane are thousands upon thousands of receptor sites, or little lock and keys, or doorways into the cell, so that good nutrients and things can get into the cell, and bad ones can get out. So if you block those, then the receptors can't work. And we have membranes, big cell membranes around the whole of the cell, and then we have membranes around each of the organelles inside the cell. And most important is the membrane around the nucleus of the cell, which contains the DNA. And those nuclear receptors are very important because they act to tell directly the DNA what to do, to switch it on or switch it off. Do we express this gene, do we not? So if you've got a toxin in there, the toxin locks on to the receptor, and then the receptor can't work, and so you don't get the gene expressing itself. And most of those nuclear receptors are responsive to the fat-soluble vitamins. So we have the retinoid receptors, which are all the vitamin A, and we have the VDRs, the vitamin D receptors in there. And these are all, particularly in the white cells, which we'll talk about in the next seminar, very dependent upon vitamin D being able to get into the cell. So if our cell is hardened, it's stiff, it can't work properly. It can't get the messages in and out. So we don't want toxic metals to build up around these receptors because they'll block it. So a good example here is lead. Lead interferes with the calcium-dependent release in certain neurotransmitters, and lead disrupts the activation of vitamin D to its hydroxylated form. So that means primarily that we're not, even with high levels of lead, we're not going to get our vitamin D to work. And this is what I find in my clinic consistently, that 50% of my vitamin D patients are deficient in vitamin D. That's fine, you know, they haven't been in the sunshine and things. But the other 50% have got vitamin D, but they can't get it to work. So it's like pyridoxine and pyridoxal 5-phosphate. Can they activate it to get it to work? And that seems to be the bigger problem. So why is it they can't activate it? Usually because there's a toxin in there, which we look at, and lead is one of those. Lead, calcium and iron, and cadmium and iron interfere with the gastrointestinal homeostasis. Vitamin C reduces the absorption of lead, which is good, and cadmium because of an increase in the absorption of iron. So vitamin C is, in that sense, stops us from absorbing so much. So technically it's not a chelator, in other words it doesn't claw the toxic metal out, but it stops us from absorbing so much. So vitamin C is one of the first things to think about, maybe supplementing somebody who has got a toxic metal overload. So anecdotal observations about chelation of toxic metals reduces liver-produced cholesterol, lowered insulin requirements in diabetics, reduced high blood pressure, normalization of cardiac arrhythmias, relief from muscle cramps, reduction of allergic symptoms, normalization of weight, improved psychological emotional status, enhanced sensory input and reversal of impotence, and cold extremities become warmer. Now, you may have heard of the word chelation. Chelation means to claw, or in other words, to eliminate the toxic substance. It's a medical procedure usually that involves the administration of a drug to remove specific heavy metals. The problem with most of these agents is that they do effectively eliminate toxic metals, but they also take out good metals, essential metals as well. So in the case if people are having chelation therapy, they need to replace the minerals. So with a multiple mineral complex, particularly zinc and copper and magnesium, need to be replaced because they will come out with the chelating substance. So DMSA, or dimercaptosuccinic acid, is one of these. Now I'm going to whip through these. Alpha-lipoic acid is a more natural substance which is actually produced in the body and maybe we can obtain from food. So technically that wouldn't be counted as a drug because it's a natural substance for the body. It works here in the conversion of pyruvate into acetyl-CoA in the mitochondria. Mercaptol or BLA is another one. That's designed, as you can see there, specifically to chelate arsenic. Thiamine tetrahydroferrol disulfate, another one, penicillamine, N-acetylcysteine. This again is made naturally in the body from when we break down glutathione, and this is a great chelator. Again, it tends to chelate out good ones as well, so we don't use NAC and acetylcysteine for more than maybe a few weeks at a time. EDTA and DMPA, these are all drugs. So what I want to just go back and look at DMSA, if you just look at the picture of it, and then look at the picture of alpha-lipoic acid. If I go back to that one, I'll give you a clue. Get the gist of it? Okay. The gist of it is sulfur. So sulfur is the major chelator of metals out of the body because sulfur, as I said before, has a valency of 2, 4 or 6. So it can swing out arms and legs to grab hold of substances attached to good elements like oxygen and hydrogen, but it can also claw or get hold of cadmium and mercury and so on. So sulfation is one of the most important ways of detoxifying. So maybe if you're a poor sulfation person from a detoxification point, you're more likely to accumulate toxic metals in there. So looking at the production of heme, which goes on to make hemoglobin and a number of other ones, which we've dealt with in previous modules. We see here, and we'll go in a little bit more detail, how we make heme from succinyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle here, and then these intermediate substances on the way of making heme are called porphyrins. Porphyrins, you remember, that's when the urine goes more purpley colour. So this is a very common disorder, different breaks in here and producing a build-up of these porphyrins. And lead was the first one to be seen to inhibit the conversion here of succinyl-CoA with glycine into alpha-levulinic acid here. So this is one of the problems with lead toxicity, and this is what they noticed, that people who had lead toxicity didn't produce enough heme. So their level of oxygen, and particularly in the hungry areas of the body, which is the brain didn't function properly. And they noticed this with children who had learning difficulties and behavior problems, that they were high in lead, and it was exactly here that it inhibited. Mercury inhibits the pathway here, so methylbalane to uroporphinogen here. Cadmium inhibits here as well. and fluorine inhibits the last part here. So fluorine itself is not a metal, it's a gas, but it has an inhibitory effect on the last part of making heme. So looking in a little bit more detail here, alpha-levulinic acid being inhibited by lead. So here we see succinyl-CoA in the Krebs cycle with the addition of glycine, goes on to make the first part of making the heme pathway. So again here we see inhibited by Pb or lead. Here we see this pathway, this one inhibited by high levels of copper. So again, copper can be good, it's essential, but also it can be harmful in high levels. Mercury, cadmium, inhibited by high levels of copper there. Inhibited, as we go to protoporphyrin, inhibited by fluorine, which is actually present in a large number of pesticides. And if you think about it, we all probably ingest pesticides every day, even if we basically keep to an organic diet. You can never get everything 100% organic. You can do your best. But you can imagine if you do eat a lot of ordinary food which is non-organic, you must be taking pesticides in, which includes toxic metals in that, like arsenic and fluorine, every day. And basically the health goes down. But you get used to it because that becomes your normal. So you don't know what is abnormal unless you can go back and say, well, actually on a scale of 1 to 100, my energy is not as good as what it used to be, which it should be, basically as good. So you get put into this the aging process, oh, well, what to expect, you're 50, 60, whatever it might be. You shouldn't expect to be as fit as you were when you were 30. And the reason is that you've accumulated a lot of junk, and mainly because you become more deficient. So the more you're exposed to toxins like pesticides, the greater the amount of the right nutrients you need to aid the detoxification process. So heme goes on, here's that last part, is again inhibited by lead, which goes on to produce the blood disorder of aplastic anemia, when both the red cells and the white cells go down in their count, which is a pretty classic toxicity problem. I suspect the same thing in the opposite direction with leukemia, where you've got high white cell counts, and maybe Hodgkin's, that it's a functional problem. It's a toxin in there coupled with a deficiency. So there's probably a deficiency on one side, particularly of B12, and a toxin accumulation. So heme goes on to make hemoglobin. It goes on to make cytochrome C, which is in the mitochondria. So if we don't make enough cytochrome C, we then don't make the energy. So now we've got low oxygen and low energy, which is not really very good indication for health. Cytochrome P450 are all heme-dependent enzymes, so we can't detoxify either. So now we're really cornered, aren't we? Low oxygen, low energy, and can't detoxify. Catalase, which is involved in myeloperoxidase with the immune system, so we can't fight with our immune system either. We can't dilate our blood vessels in nitric oxide synthase. We can't get rid of homocysteine because cystathionine synthase is inhibited. And worst of all, you can't drink wine because you've got sulfate oxidase inhibition, which means you can't get rid of sulfites within wine. So there's lots of bad things not being able to produce enough heme. So it's very important to remember that low heme does indicate in a whole range of heme or iron-dependent enzymes become inhibited. And you'll see these are all oxidation enzymes. They all require oxygen. So back to the periodic table. And here's Mendeleev at 101. So he got the honor, Mendeleev, of having an element finally named after him, but it was an artificial one that it only lasts for a fraction of a second in laboratory conditions. So basically, everything up to 99, 100 is around. Beyond that, I think they've gone up now to something like 120, but in atomic numbers. But of course, they're not naturally occurring.